Can you hear us in the room, Sophia?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. We can hear you. Awesome.
Okay, great.
I'm just pulling up um, Meet Echo on my laptop. Do we have both our speakers here?
Don't think Lana is here, but let me see. Bharat is here.
Great. All right, we'll get started in just a minute.
Yeah, your audio is a little bit fainted. Yeah, that makes it better.
Is that gonna be better? Okay. I wish you were here, Sophia. There's a chair right
Me
here.
too. Next time we'll be there. Next time is London,
Awesome.
so we'll be fine.
Okay, good. All right. Well, we can go ahead and get started. Also, thanks to folks who've attended in the room. I'm going to have to do a few things about people in the room, even though most of our participants are online. So reminder that if you are wanting to get into the queue later, you'll need to join Meet Echo from your mobile phone or from your computer to get in the queue. So please do that. Also for the blue sheets reason. Then also please remember you have to keep your mask on. There aren't a lot of us and we're pretty spread out, but it's an important reminder because it's the policy of the event. And yeah, I think actually that's it. So from here, then we'll just transition into the welcome slides. So give me a moment to bring those up. I've forgotten how to do this actually. No, it's not that hard.
Mallory, please see the mic.
Is it still faint? Okay. It's loud in this room though. That's the problem. All right, so this is the agenda. We can certainly take suggestions to it because I think we have a full 2 hours and plenty of time. But we have 2 speakers and as well, we have 2 drafts to talk about. So we'll take those in turn. Both speakers are going to have 30 minutes, and then essentially we have an hour for other working group stuff, which is great. Before we get started, I think this is more of a reminder I'll make after the talks, but we do need to take notes. So if somebody can commit now to taking notes, particularly during the time when we're talking about working group documents, that would be really great. So I'm going to pause for a second. Wait for a volunteer. Would really love notes. So I'll do another reminder after the speakers are done. Hopefully I'll remember because yeah, we need to capture action points from these 2 drafts. You can take them and then upload them afterwards, but it's entirely up to you. I'll make another announcement. Maybe we'll see. But thank you very much for. Okay, so we have the note well. The note well has several different portions of it that by now you've seen many times. But the first portion is around intellectual property. So know your responsibilities around that. An important one as well, part of the note well is the privacy and code of conduct. So within that, know that this session is being recorded. And other than that, you just need to familiarize yourself with with this policy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about and welcome you all to the HRPC session, which is part of the IRTF, the Internet Research Task Force. We're looking at the longer term research issue related to human rights, as with other research groups within the IRTF. We're not developing standards, but we are writing documents. We publish informational documents mostly in the HRPC. With the RFC series, we have one which I'll get to, but we're here to promote research in this area. So we're also looking to collaborate with others doing research in other research institutions, and it's an explicit goal of the IRTF. You can read more about the IRTF in RFC 7418. So this research group is specifically chartered to look at the ways that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is its own sort of standard to some degree, and how it overlaps and aligns with standards development for the long-term sustainability of the internet. We have in our charter these main objectives. So we're looking at the relationship, as I said. We have a specific focus in the UDHR on two main rights. The first is freedom of expression, and the other is freedom of association and assembly. But we do look at others. With respect to the right to privacy, which is obviously one that all people know pretty well, there's another research group that talks about privacy considerations. And we do some of that here, obviously, because it is a human right, but there is a different research group for that. And yeah, if you've not been to Pair G, you really ought to. It's a really interesting working group or research group. Yeah, thanks very much, Nick. Thanks for taking notes. We've got that covered then. And then, yes, the last bullet point, a lot of us that are engaged in HRPC, I don't know what the sort of proportionality is with other people that work in the IETF. We tend to work a lot outside the IETF in the larger internet governance space. And we're sort of really talking a lot about the work here outside of the IETF, IRTF, and I think bring a lot of those experiences in working outside of this space brings a lot of important perspective to the work then that we end up doing here in the IRTF too. So that's an explicit goal or objective of HRPC as well. So we do drafts. We've helped others have written academic papers. There's a short film about the work we've done that was put out quite a while ago. Data analysis and visualization has also been part of what we've had folks present on in the past and work on in and outside HRPC. And then there's a bunch of us that tend to do reviews outside of this working group or research group, and we're mostly focused then on thinking about what those impacts would have on human rights and vice versa. So these are a bunch of different things we're doing. Not all of it is writing drafts, as you'll notice. So part of being active in HRPC, there's a lot of room for creative contribution. And these are the main things that we've got on our plate. I'm going to take this off because I'm having trouble breathing. We were sort of chartered way back in 2015. There was work that led to that moment that was pretty important, and we've also had an RFC published that really lays out the gamut of work between the human rights space and the protocol consideration space, RFC 8280. Current work, we have two drafts right now. Our draft guidelines is very much an iteration on the 8280 draft that lays out a little bit more succinctly or concisely for protocol designers what they might be looking for with respect to human rights. So it's more of a sort of checklist or guidance document, right? That's in the queue already. I think it might be with the IRTF chair. And then freedom of association on the internet, we have a full discussion planned for you today because there's been an update to that. There are other drafts in this group that have expired, but so we've not considered those for now. So these are the talks. So I will take each one in turn, but before I move on, just wanted to make sure there are no questions, or I'm not forgetting anything in the welcome. Sophie, do you have anything you want to say?
No, all covered. Thank you.
Okay, great. I'm just taking a moment as well. All right, great. Bharath, so glad to have you with us. Your talk is on computing within limits, and I will let you introduce yourself. But just to say, we're really happy that you've come to talk to us about this. Really want the rest of the folks here to realize that there have been a lot of discussion of these same topics in other places in the IETF, and I think that's valuable. And so we're really happy to also be a place where people can discuss what impact computation itself is having on the environment and on the sustainability of the internet. So please go ahead. I'm going to put myself, well, I can't put myself on mute, but I'm going to hand you the reins.
Sounds good. I can do this. Let's see. There we go. All right. And let's see if it gave me. I think I need permission to share slides, or should I just share screen? Oh, there we go. Okay. So yeah, thanks for inviting me. This is going to be a little bit of a weird talk in a lot of different ways, in that hopefully it won't be boring, that I reflect a little bit on what brought me to thinking about these topics, because usually it's about the content itself, but I think the process of getting to thinking about these questions in this way was itself part of the challenge. So what I kind of want to talk about is this really big picture question of where we headed globally from. Mostly I'm going to be talking about a sort of a sustainability perspective, ecological sustainability and related sustainabilities. And then, of course, what can be done about it, what should be done about it. And, you know, my background before I started thinking about these questions was a very traditional sort of networking background. When I did my PhD in networking, you know, I wasn't working on any sustainability or energy or any of that kind of stuff. It was all, you know, relatively standard congestion control, you know, routing protocols, privacy and security. Those were sort of the areas of my research focus, and they still are to a certain extent today. But I went from that being 100% of my research to a third of my research being sort of traditional networking, a third of it being privacy and security, and then a third of it being things like agriculture and urban planning and things that don't have anything to do with my actual formal background. And what the steps that it took sort of for me to decide to work on that kind of stuff is what's a little bit I want to talk about, and then we can have a discussion about, you know, what are the important questions that we need to be working on and how do we sort of address them using our backgrounds. So, you know, this notion of limits has been on my mind for quite some time. And, you know, the term really sort of came to prominence from the classic study Limits to Growth in the 1970s, and then it was updated several times. And the interesting thing about that study, which I'll have a little bit more about later, is that it's actually deeply insightful, but it kind of got lost over the years. It got a lot of popular sort of attention in the 1970s. Then it got dismissed in the 1980s because people interpreted it as a prediction that all of a sudden, you know, the world would run out of food or something like that. And so, which wasn't what it actually said. And then it got kind of ignored. But the actual core message of it is quite important, that, you know, there are ecological limits that the world lives within, and it would be good to understand what is the dynamic of that. And so as systems people, I think we can kind of appreciate that systems have various dynamics. They have feedback loops. They have, you know, ecological systems, social systems, economic systems, technological systems. They all have these feedback loops. And limits to growth was a study of how do those feedback loops interact with various policy mechanisms, with various ecological mechanisms, economic mechanisms. And they tried to come up with lots of scenarios to think about the world. And so I was thinking, I think really starting around maybe 2008, 2009, about how do those limits manifest for computing? And so there's two different pieces to it. What are the impacts to computing of limits, and what are the contributions, both positive and negative, that computing can make to the limits that society faces globally? And so, a natural place that I started, which is where I think everybody starts in computing, is how do we use energy? Because, computing fundamentally requires, significant energy. And our global footprint of computing and energy has been going up and up. So then the big question on my mind in sort of that time frame was, how do we use energy? What are the consequences? First, I wanted to understand the global energy picture, and then sort of narrow down onto the computing energy picture. And there's some natural places that you start. Even then, it's the personal footprint. So there's lots of calculators. I'm sure you've seen them. Carbon footprint, energy footprint. You can go and find your own. And the sort of the broad notion out there in the sustainability world is we should target everybody living a 2,000 watt lifestyle. That is sort of where you want to be. In the US, we're sort of averaging above 10,000 watts per person. But really we want to be closer to 2,000 watts per person globally, to both have sort of sustainable energy use, but also equitable energy use. So, I looked into this was my personal footprint when I ran it through one of these calculators several years ago. And so I was thinking about that, and then said, okay, well, where do we get energy from? And that takes you down the usual rabbit holes of like, oh, wait, well, we use a lot of oil. So why do we use oil? Well, it's really useful. And, we don't think about these questions very often as computer scientists. And so what are we going to do after we start running a little bit low on these fossil fuels that provide most of the calorie input into the foods that we eat? And so, and all the things that are made from oil are sort of all around us that we don't even think about them on a daily basis. And so these fossil fuels that are depleting, that, are used also as a strategic resource, right? So there's geopolitical and economic considerations there. We think, okay, well, let's make things more efficient. Maybe society can be made more efficient. Maybe computing can be made more efficient, and maybe computing can make society more efficient, right? We've considered all of those things societally and in the research community. And then there's the other sort of twin problem. There's the energy problem, which exacerbates climate change, but there also is energy by itself as a problem in terms of the non-renewability and finite resources, and also just sort of uneven distribution of those resources. But the climate change picture has both clarified and intensified since I started looking into this question. And it's not just me, but I'm saying from my sort of personal journey looking into this, starting maybe 15 years ago. And, we all know sort of, we hear degree C in the news, and we sort of have a notion of what these things actually mean. And, a fair amount of climate science is basically saying, and has been saying for quite some time, that there isn't much of a chance to actually stay below what's considered quote unquote dangerous levels of climate change, given the actual emissions trajectories that the world has been on. And so there's this question of like, what do we do about these twin problems that exist that then affect everything? They affect everything in every sector of life across the world. And so, we have the usual two choices. We can change our behavior, and we use fewer resources, we use less energy, and we can change the sources and find more. And so, this naturally led me down that path. Tom Murphy from UC San Diego has an excellent book and website. So his website was Do the Math. He compiled all of his writings into a book that's freely available. I think it's called Energy and Human Ambition on a Finite Planet. I think is the name of it. You can find it on Do the Math. And so this is one of the tables he put together. He went and he did a sort of first principle deep dive on all of the different energy options that are out there. And he said, what's the best option that's available? What are the different criteria that we should care about? How abundant is it? Difficult to produce? Does it produce electricity and heat, and can it be used for transportation, etc.? So this is all of the alternatives, and he sort of created this very rough categorization ranking for them. And so you see solar is sort of at the top, and then there's a number of other popular renewables. The highest score in his little table here is 5 for solar. And then he said, what about fossil fuels? And it reminds you very quickly of, well, this is why we use those sources of energy. If you leave out, and he intentionally left out the climate impact of these things, just to consider the current sort of internalized costs of these, because sort of climate change has been an externality for all this time. People have a real good reason to continue using fossil fuels. And it's hard to scale up those alternatives. And so, I looked into, well, why haven't we gotten what we thought we were going to get in terms of alternative energy sources? What are the alternatives available? Can we move computing to them, and can we move society to those alternatives? And then it's happening, but it's happening slowly. And so if you actually, Saul Griffith had been giving this excellent talk, and it's still sort of a good talk to go watch about, what are the different energy options? How quickly do we need to build stuff? And so he said, okay, well, let's say we have this sort of as our power profile sources of energy, in 2035, something like that. So, you still have a little bit of fossil fuels, you have a little bit more of everything else. And then he said, okay, well, how fast would you have to build this? Because it's a physical infrastructure that has to be built across the globe. And so these are roughly the numbers that he came up with of, you'd have to build just that little wedge of solar photovoltaic, you need 100 square meters of photovoltaics built and deployed every second globally for 20 years. And so on down the list. And so then I thought, okay, well, how feasible is this? So let's look at the manufacturing capacity. So I went and looked into what does the industry estimate? And it's not, maybe it's half of what the best estimates and optimistic estimates for manufacturing this stuff is, something like half for each of these categories. And so what that sort of led me to conclude is that we need to do sort of a crash program over 20 years to cut our energy use. And even if we did that as fast as possible, we'd probably be about 50% short of our targets, which means probably we're going to end up overshooting on the climate side rather than cutting our energy use proactively. So that leaves us in sort of a difficult position, right? And that brings us back to the limits to growth. So, the thing that they had considered was they said, okay, well, there's a lot of different scenarios about where the world is. And so they took a baseline scenario 1 in their models, and they said, we have the resources we have today, we have the ecosystem functions we have today, the policies we have today. This is the update from 2004. And they said, what happens if we just run that simulation forward in time? They said, well, we end up with a resource crisis. A resource crisis in their terms is where, because of insufficient non-renewable resources, specifically fossil fuels, industrial output and thus economic output starts faltering sometime in the 2020s is what, and the exact numbers, of course, don't, their simulation doesn't have the granularity to be able to deliver that kind of detail. But that was sort of the time frame that they were saying things would start faltering. And then they said, well, the world may discover greater, more energy resources somewhere. They may be doing, through more oil drilling, and gas drilling. We've seen that in the fracking boom, and all sorts of other sort of ways that oil and other resources might be extracted. So they said, what happens if we have way more resources? Scenario 2. In scenario 2, you end up with a pollution crisis. The economic crisis gets delayed about 20 years because you're able to find more resources so you can keep the economic growth going. But you then overshoot on pollution, and then the ecosystem crashes. And as a result of that, food production and other things start declining rapidly. And so then you end up with, sort of a sharp decline later, by 20 years or 30 years, something like that. And so the thing that sort of struck me after I went through this process myself of thinking about, what's my role in this, what's the state of the world about this, and then I came back to the limits to growth and said, okay, well, what were they really talking about? We're kind of stuck between these two scenarios right now. And we're kind of facing them down simultaneously. If you just read the news daily, you'll see we're kind of facing down these exact two scenarios on a daily basis right now. It's not clear which one of them we're in, but it seems like we're in half of one and half the other. And people have been talking about this for a long time. So I found that Carter had been talking about this in 1974. This was during the time when there were sort of more manifest energy limits that were apparent, and then through more drilling and sort of other sort of factors, this was sort of forgotten. And so that sort of brings me back to, okay, well, what do we do about this? What do we do about this both as individuals and then also as computer scientists? And then even more specifically, perhaps as networking people. But I try not to put that hat on unless I have to in this question. So the natural places that people go, and there's more attention to this now, and I think it's great, is sustainable computing. And I want to distinguish sustainable computing from computing for sustainability. Sustainable computing I see as, how do we make computing itself sustainable? Use fewer resources, have less e-waste, use less electricity, design for reuse and repair, all of that kind of stuff I would put under sustainable computing. Then there's computing for sustainability, which is, how do we use computing to make the rest of society, all the different things that we do in our daily lives, more sustainable? And so, what's sort of been done in that and what's important, I would say that what I've kind of concluded is that the ratio of importance in my mind is 5 to 95%. Sustainable computing itself is important. We should put our efforts into it. But at the end of the day, computing uses a small amount of total resources globally, probably around 5% of energy. And so, part of the way that I sort of came to this conclusion was in 2011, I'd been wondering about this question. So we wrote a short paper in Hotnet's Energy and Emergy of the Internet, where we looked into, it was very rough calculation of how much energy does the internet use, both in wall socket power and in the manufacturing energy that goes into actually building everything that's used, all of our networking devices, small and big. And at the time we concluded that the internet, if you include both the embodied energy and the wall socket power, something like 300 gigawatts global, so it's everything. A grad student who I work with updated these numbers last year, and I think it's maybe doubled or 2.5 times in over 10 years. But the amount of traffic that the internet carried per year has gone up way more than that. So the efficiency of the internet has actually gone up quite a bit. So the sort of joules per byte has plummeted over 10 years, which is really a testament to the networking community making things much faster and more efficient without using too much more energy to do it. So that's great. So after I sort of been looking into that, I thought, okay, well, maybe, we have two choices. We can work on sustainable computing or computing for sustainability. And the conclusion I came to was really that computing still is a small piece of the overall puzzle. If you actually go look, agriculture is about 1/3 of total carbon emissions globally, and transportation is just under that, and power generation is just under that. So these are huge sectors of economic life and daily life that are perhaps more affecting our society than computing is. And computing can maybe be used to help in this context. And so those are the 4 big ones that I've started looking into. I haven't really done too much on the manufacturing piece, but agriculture, transportation, and power generation have been areas that I've been interested in. Agriculture and power generation specifically, I've sort of focused on, especially the agriculture piece. And I can talk a little bit more about that research, the specific research there, if someone's interested. The gist of it is that I think it's important not to bring just an optimization mindset. So the natural thing that I tend to see when people do computing for sustainability is say, look at some other sector, and they're all desperate for computer scientists, at least they seem to be, because they want our help in processing big data sets and doing analysis and throwing machine learning models at everything. But what typically ends up happening is that it optimizes an already broken system to make it slightly less efficient or slightly more efficient, but that actually further entrenches a broken system that may be unsustainable for the long run. So in the context of agriculture, I've been focused on how do we look at different systems of agriculture other than sort of monoculture industrial agriculture, which is very unsustainable as it's practiced mostly everywhere in the world today. Because if we optimize that system further, if we say, well, we can irrigate a little better because we can throw this machine learning model at it, or we can fertilize better, then ultimately that system is still a broken system. It's just further entrenched. So instead, it may sound crazy, but you may remember this work on Headerspace Analysis that was done, I don't know, about 10 years ago, where they were looking at packet headers and how do you analyze, the state of all possible packet headers and all the things you can do, and sort of there's interesting formal methods that come out of that. It turns out that you can actually use a state space type analysis and apply that thinking to agriculture, and that's what we've been doing, because agriculture in some ways is a state space planning problem. And so by reconceptualizing it that way, we then are basically searching the state space of possible agro ecosystems to be designed. And so that's sort of the research that I'm doing. It's way outside of the realm of normal networking. I'm working with people from computer graphics and reinforcement learning and some actual agriculture people. And I do a lot of agriculture sort of myself as a personal interest. So it's a very weird direction for a networking person to go in. Power generation is something that's a little bit closer to home for most networking folks. There's a lot of work you can do in that space on sort of microgrids and sort of planning of renewable energy use, both for computing and non-computing uses. Then there's sort of stepping back further from sectors to the bigger picture things in life, right? How do we consume things? How do we produce things? How do we finance things? And how do we govern? And I think those are things that IETF actually knows quite a bit about. If you think it's sort of a meta level of what does IETF do as an organization and IRTF do as an organization. And then there's the even bigger picture, which is extremely challenging as engineers and researchers to tackle, but really these are the things that shape our society and force us to make the choices that we do, the culture and the perspective, the flexibility we have with the choices we make and the wisdom we have in choosing them. So it's a strange talk, I know. I'd love to chat with you all about where do we go from here. And I wanted to finally leave you with this quote from Limits to Growth about where do we go from here.
Thanks so much, Baraf. I was just finishing reading that quote, which is a really good one. The world is far too complex for easy solutions. So thanks for bringing a really complex talk to us. So we've got the mic queue open. Reminder that if you're on site, you want to get in the queue with the app.
Now it's
yeah, the top line says not industry is the cause of all problems or the cure, and then it goes on to nor governments is the cause or the cure, etc.
Hi, Barath. This is a great talk. This is Lars Eggert. I mostly came up because I sort of got interested when you mentioned your hotness paper from way back when, because I remember I saw it and I forgot about it. And thanks for reminding me. So the IAB is actually looking into a workshop, which is not sort of super related, but it's basically looking at the environmental footprint of the internet and its applications and services. And I would I'm hoping that you'd be interested and you have other people to bring to that conversation. So I'm going to send you an email about that. I'm also mentioning it to other people in the crowd that might be interested on that. You can send email to the HRPC list and we'll connect you to that effort. Thank you.
Sounds great.
Yeah, next in the queue, Niels, are you able to get on the mic?
Yeah, I think. Am I too loud?
No, you're great.
Okay. Thanks so much for this excellent talk. Really, I think I got an echo here. Let me switch up this volume. So the talk was great, and you mentioned that like industry actors, governments are entangled in this problem, right? And that comes very clearly from your analysis. But then how would you translate that back to what individuals and institutions can do and should do? And how do you think an institution such as the IETF, IRTF, should conceptualize this? So, because I get how we measure back, but how do we measure then back up? And how do we operationalize and instrumentalize that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one I've been struggling with, so I don't think I have a clean answer to it, but I'll give it a try. So, the way I look at it is at the individual level, what I've found has been useful is leveraging my thinking, my sort of systems thinking as a networking person in applying it in these other contexts. Now, that's not a direct route at all because, that doesn't speak to quite your IETF question. I'll try and do that in a sec. But at least as individuals, I've found that we actually do have a unique way of thinking, of systems thinking that really out there is not very common. And what I've found is ecologists may be as close to computers networking people as you will find in other disciplines. But ecologists get no attention. Nobody pays attention to what ecologists are saying. They've been screaming about this stuff for years and everybody's ignored them to our detriment. But they pay attention to networking folks. And so in some ways, when we bring a networking perspective to these problems, we are both contributing to the systems thinking, which understands the complexity, the feedback loops, how you have to intervene in systems in complex ways. There's no sort of magic solution that, everybody thinks there's a magic solution to this stuff. And we understand, given the complexity of the internet, that we have to grapple with complex systems and we know how to do it. So that's how I think we actually contribute. I found that when I talk to these agriculture colleagues, they are stuck. The very few people who want to sort of change the way agriculture works, both in academia and industry, get very little attention. And it's very sort of reductive, simple approaches that tend to dominate. But they don't know how to think computationally and sort of in the way we do. So that's at the personal level. At the institutional level, that gets a little more tricky because IETF, I imagine, has a closer mandate tied to the internet and networking than we can't, IETF is not going to be doing anything agriculture related, likely, I think, anytime soon. But the one place this can tie in is a perfect example of this is in sort of renewable energy use of data centers, of networking facilities. If you look at all the various big companies, they all have tried to at least have public messaging about we want to use green energy, we want to be renewable, et cetera. But you look in the fine print and there's actually important details that are left out. I'd say many of them are not really doing it. They do things like they say, well, over the year, we purchase enough renewable energy to offset our usage, but the diurnal patterns of renewable energy tend to completely make that irrelevant because you can buy a bunch of useless solar power that's getting burned because nobody can consume it during the middle of the day. And then you're buying a bunch of coal or natural gas power at nighttime. And so that's where standards can percolate up from the IETF about what does it mean to say that you are a green network facility or that's just an example, but of that kind of thing. So it's about what computing and networking is about.
Is that something you might be interested in writing a draft about?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, there are probably people who have much deeper expertise than me on this, but I know some of those folks, so we can rope them in.
Go ahead, Nick, you're in the queue next.
Yeah, thank you for a very useful and insightful talk. I think it's useful for maybe many of us who are in the situation of not quite knowing all the details of this area, but caring more about it, to have some of that context. I'm sort of struck by this sort of all people and institutions quote, as maybe addressing the question of your sort of earlier point about which things are likely to have the most impact. And so I have the intuition, and maybe since you've thought more about this, you can give us some insight into it. While it seems logical to work on the largest impact things, it also sounds like, well, if we're in an emergency situation where we have to reduce energy usage by this enormous amount, that we're actually going to have to work in all areas in parallel rather than just working on the largest areas. So yeah, maybe 600 gigawatts is not that much. Still sounds like quite a bit. So I wonder if that means like we should be trying to make everything sustainable, even not the largest users. But I'm also curious if there's like general things we could learn that would.
Yeah, so I absolutely agree that it is important to work on all things. It's not that we don't want to work on energy use of computing because agriculture is a bigger impact globally. The part of the reason that I've focused on things outside of computing and making computing more efficient is that the incentives are already lined up for larger companies to make computing more efficient, simply because renewable power has become cheaper and it's easier to power computing using renewable energy. So at least from the operational energy use standpoint of data centers and so on, that's already happening. So, my attention there isn't going to improve or hinder things. Lack of attention is going to hinder things. Whereas in agriculture, there's so much there. The low hanging fruit is enormous. And, not very much is being done. So that's part of the reason. In terms of energy use of computing, one of the things that struck me, and it hasn't really changed that much, when we did that 2011 study, we found 50% of the energy use was the embodied power. So it's the manufacturing energy amortized over the lifespan of the device. And that really points to keeping things longer, keeping old equipment running longer, especially if you can just run it on renewable power when the renewable power is available, is actually a net win from an energy standpoint. And so that is a whole agenda, I think an interesting networking and systems agenda on its own. How do you keep old stuff running in a way that it's still useful to delivering, to running systems, and do it in a way that you only run it when there's renewable power available?
So, great perspective. And I'm wondering if you could say a word about this intersection between IETF and the perspective you share, this very global perspective. Does culture stand out as the opportunity where IETF could do a lot more in order to impact all the secondary things that only culture can really change? Thank you.
Yeah, maybe so. The thing I don't quite know is what is the interface between IETF and the broader computing community, and what's the interface of IETF with the broader world community, right? So in a sense of where does IETF have leverage where its voice as a community actually can make a difference outside of the IETF? Obviously, IETF has huge influence in the networking world outside of IETF. It probably has less of an influence at the sort of computing world level, so not networking specific, and then maybe like even less once you get one step further. But it may be the case, going back to this thing about ecologists having very little voice in sort of everyday life, we at least have more of a voice because we're providing, critical infrastructure for the world. And so in that sense, people will actually listen. The question is, how do we tie it, I think, to the culture question? How do we tie the changes we want to see in the broader culture to what people see as our remit? And so probably the cleanest leverage is relating to internet infrastructure. One of those can be about sustainability of the internet's infrastructure. You could frame it in many different ways. Climate disasters will lead to internet outages, and therefore we need to plan for resilience. Planning for resilience means local renewable energy. This is how we think it should be done. And we know because we're the IETF. So that sort of provides a through line maybe. And then the culture piece can then come from out of that. I'm just thinking out loud though.
Thank you.
Hello, Tom Hill. I hope you can hear me. An absolutely fascinating talk, Barath. I actually found that incredibly interesting. I wanted to just make a quick point about agriculture and the networking, the work we do around here. IoT has a huge role to play actually in the efficiency of agriculture, and that I've seen some of this from where I grew up, and certainly some of the work that I think my employer's done in the past, which is quite fun. A much broader point, and I'm not sure if this is actually a question or just an observation, but I've obviously in recent times we've seen some very large leaps in changes around energy usage, partly because something we couldn't have necessarily predicted. Someone went to war in another country, and all of a sudden energy prices have shot up massively across the world. Other things that tend to happen, Elon Musk tweets about things, and suddenly everyone wants to buy his cars, or for example, everyone wants to buy Dogecoin instead of Bitcoin, vice versa. Either way it goes around. The concern I have is that, of course, we are all we're all tasked really with making iterative improvements to this, but I really don't, I'm not entirely sure how we will be able to compete as an organization with the actions of lunatics waging war and celebrities tweeting. I feel like much more could be done or undone in those respects, to the point where I'm not sure how much the IETF could contribute in this place. I mean, all of the work that we could do over multiple years could be unpicked in a second. So there are certain things that we could perhaps in very broad swathes look at enacting. I mean, I think we really probably should take quite an honest look at blockchains and the amount of electricity that goes into running them and keeping them running. Perhaps, there are definitely drafts floating around. There's lots of research going around on that subject. Can we be more honest with ourselves about the direction we're taking and the much bigger concepts around energy usage and where we're being wasteful? And of course, a lot of us have come here on planes as well to this event. Do we have to be really, really honest with ourselves about whether or not that's appropriate? And I know everyone's desperately happy to be back here in the room if they're able, but as am I. But should we be showing ourselves as a greater example, as it were? And what are the big things that we can do to grab attention on that front? I think that's about the only way that you can deal with Elon Musk. and compete with that. So anyway, again,
Yeah.
thank you very much. It was really, really fascinating. So thank you.
Yeah, your point is well taken. I agree that it is challenging, the scale of the problem and also the scale of the voices that are out there that can shape events are far beyond what IETF can do. But the one thing that also is true is that I often tell people there is a small group of folks, the IETF community, who keeps the internet running, and you don't know about it. But you wouldn't be able to access the internet. It didn't happen this way. And so in some ways, not being in the headlines sometimes can be an advantage, but you can still, IETF actually has the power to shape things. I mean, the example I was giving about, standards for data centers is just a minor one, but there's also the sort of climate resilient networking. That could be a long-term infrastructure change that occurs, and then it has ripple effects throughout other infrastructures, energy infrastructure, and so on. And so I think that's where the leverage is for an engineering-oriented organization.
Great, and I'm last in the queue, and then we'll move on to the next talk. But I just wanted to point out that one of your slides, it made me think that there's a bunch of trade-offs in this work. There's a lot of space for thinking about how one solution may have knock-on effects in other areas, and negotiating that is not trivial. And that happens to be very strongly paralleled in the human rights space as well. Actually, a lot of the work that as human rights advocates we do, especially in sort of tangential areas like technology, is actually having a conversation about trade-offs and where you prioritize certain rights or certain principles over others, and what the finer edges of that are. So that could also potentially be an avenue that could be additive to the larger space, where a lot of folks have talked about one thing or another, maybe a sweep over all the different options and figuring out how to create a principled approach to trading off things when they come into conflict could be something that the folks in HRPC would be well suited to attempt. Thanks very much
Sounds
for your
great.
talk, Bharath. It was awesome.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So hoping we have future work here. We always want to try to bring in speakers who give us all inspiration for areas we could take the work. And so I think HRPC could be a really good place to write and publish and talk about some of this in an ongoing way. So we hope that you stick around, and that others can send us pointers for potentially starting documents and things. Okay, so with that, we're now moving on to our next speaker. So Alana, are you online?
Yeah.
Great, welcome. You should be able to load your own slides by clicking on the, let's see, are you already doing that? There you are. Okay, good, you've got it.
That works.
All right, welcome. Take it away.
Beautiful. Thank you. So hi, everyone. My name is Lana. I am a postdoc at Cornell Tech. I'm also the director of operations at somewhere called the Clinic to End Tech Abuse. And I'm really excited to be talking to you all about understanding and responding to technology abuse, and how that might possibly affect what you all do at the IETF. So let me just learn how to use this slide. There we go. So the way that this talk is kind of structured is that I was first going to go over some background information about technology abuse and the Clinic to End Tech Abuse and myself and what we do, and then talk about tech abuse in practice from what we actually see. And then I was hoping to end with some like open issues, some active questions that I run across in my day-to-day. And just what some things that we can't yet respond to, but that we would like to respond to in the area of tech abuse look like. So with that, I'll start with just introducing myself. Like I said, I'm the director of operations at the Clinic to End Tech Abuse. I think some of the most interesting thing about my background as it pertains to this talk is that I have a very technical background. I received my PhD in databases, programming languages, and systems last year, which is very different from the work that I do now. But during my academic background, I also spent time working as a survivor advocate. So I was an advocate at the Columbia Rape Crisis Center, at the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. I worked in consent education. And I think that both of those experiences, this like very systems-oriented technical academic background and my background also as a survivor advocate, really shaped the way that I think about all of the protocols that we put into place when we are trying to help people with technology abuse. And with all that said, I think like a good next question is, what is technology abuse? This definition is from one of our earlier papers at CETA, which is just defines tech abuse as the many ways where an abuser can use a digital technology to intimidate, threaten, monitor, impersonate, harass, or otherwise harm their victims. And so I'll talk a little bit more about what we do at CETA in a moment, but just to take an example from one of the clients that we see who are experiencing technology abuse that we've interviewed, I think that this quote really wraps up how insidious technology abuse can be in certain vulnerable populations, such as survivors of intimate partner violence. So this survivor describes their abuser tracking everything that they're doing. Whatever I do, he sees that, he's harassing me until now. And the survivor had an order of protection, but the harasser, the abuser, was using spoofing apps to harass the client from different numbers. And because the way that our legal systems work don't really take into account the technological abilities that abusers have, basically a lot of forms of technology abuse are invisibilized by courts. So even though it was clearly the abuser calling from these spoofed phone numbers, it wasn't the phone number that was listed under the order of protection. And so the police would not respond to this continuation of harassment and abuse. So I think that this example really highlights how insidious tech abuse can be for survivors. And when we talk about technology abuse and the security threats that technology abuse plays in the role of intimate partner violence, I call them intimate partner violence aware threat models. And what I mean by that is that in computer security, we have threat models that locate the attacker as being this person who has no physical proximity or little physical proximity and no social proximity to the attacker. So all the information that the attacker has about the target is information that they got through their attacks or through their infiltration. And that's an assumption that doesn't hold when we're talking about intimate partner violence, where the abuser is someone who is well known to the target and who might have a lot of personalized or individualized information about the person that they're trying to attack. And what that looks like, again, to use another example from practice from one of our survivors that we've interviewed, this survivor was using passwords that was a family member's names and using family members' birthdays as a pen, which we know is not necessarily the greatest security practice, but it does mean that for someone who is an intimate partner or someone who might have information about this person at a personal level, that they would be able to know and guess all of that information and know how this person deploys their passwords and uses them. And another issue that comes up is this idea of identity verification in the second part of this quote, where the survivor is saying that they're trying to reset their password, but because the abuser had control over the phone number and the survivor no longer had access to the phone number, they couldn't use the recovery mechanisms that were in place. So since they don't have that phone number, they can't reset anything. And I'm going to take a second here just to talk about what an intimate partner is while we're talking about intimate partner aware threat models. I think that this language tends to evoke the idea of a romantic partner, which is absolutely true. And many of the survivors that we see are being harassed or stalked or abused by a former romantic partner. But this threat model is general enough to sort of encompass anyone who has close social relationships with the victim or the survivor. So you can think, for example, children, family members, people who rely on caretakers. So that would be people with disabilities, elderly people, and even friends can all be kind of captured by this threat model of an intimate partner. So we have a tech abuse clinic that responds to this. And so to kind of set up what we do in our clinic is that we are a free consultative service, and we train volunteers in the dynamics of coercive control. And we pair them with survivors who are experiencing technology abuse. And we have these sessions or consultations with them one-on-one where we listen to their story and we listen to like what's going on with their technology and how they're being harassed or otherwise abused. And then we try and find ways that we can maybe structure interventions that respond to their specific situation. And so this definition is borrowed from our friends and close collaborators at the Technology-Enabled Coercive Control Clinic in Seattle, Dana Cromo and Natalie Dolce. I think it really nicely encapsulates what a tech abuse clinic is. And CETA, or the Clinic to End Tech Abuse, is one of the first such of these clinics, if not the first. It's a technology abuse clinic that's run out of Cornell Tech. We also act as a research and education and a policy hub, generally focusing on this intersection of intimate partner violence and technology. So the way that CETA works is that we actually partner with the New York City Mayor's Office to end domestic and gender-based violence, and several other local agencies in New York City that are already working with survivors of intimate partner violence. And those agencies, when they see that their clients are having or experiencing technology-related abuse, then they refer them to us. And then that's how we get in touch with them and start meeting with them and talking about them. And from these experiences, we've been able to gather a lot of data and conduct research based on the experiences gleaned from those interactions with survivors. So we are first and foremost a service. We first and foremost serve our clients, whether they want to participate in research or not, but we do also use the information that we get from that to take away some broader points. Of course, there are some limitations to the way that we receive referrals. And so none of this is intended in any way to be an accurate assessment of like this percentage of people experience this or this percentage experience that, since we're really limited to who we're referred by, but it does give us some information about how technology abuse plays out in these situations. So this was started in 2016 by professors Nikki Dell and Tom Bristenpart. We serve all 5 boroughs of New York City, and only New York City. We do not take referrals from survivors who are not attached to actually one of our partner agencies. But over that time, we've received over 400 referrals to date from the local IPV agencies, more probably since the last time I checked on this number. And we currently have about 20 plus active volunteers who range in backgrounds from being cybersecurity experts, technologists at large tech companies, social workers, students, and academics. If this talk in any way inspires you to want to come join us, we are accepting applications for new volunteers, so feel free to get in touch with me about that as well. And so during this time, in this past 6 years, what I wanted to share was some takeaways from what we've actually seen in that time and with the survivors that were spoken to. So tech abuse in practice. I wanted to start with this taxonomy of attacks because I think it's useful for kind of giving a sense of all the different ways that technology can be used to harass or abuse survivors of intimate partner violence. And so this is based off of a 2018 analysis in which we identified 4 types of attacks. I've since updated it to add my kind of 5th that's like a little bit like we can work on the wording, but I think that it was necessary to capture something else that we've been seeing that we didn't see in 2018. So these are the 5 types of attacks that we see, or how we kind of categorize them in this taxonomy: account and device compromise, ownership-based attacks, exposure of private information, harassment, and technology-assisted monitoring. And I'm going to run through some examples of what those look like in practice. So for account and device compromise, this usually means monitoring digital communication, like being logged into someone's emails and reading their emails or text messages. It can also mean using the account access that you have to delete someone's accounts, which is particularly difficult when it's an account that someone uses for their business. So I've seen people's like the pages that they use for like a business that they run being taken down from Instagram and deleted permanently. It's also really common for people to use this access to delete evidence of abuse. So for example, text messages, photos that documented the abuse history, or for the abuser to impersonate the survivor. There's a lot of other things that people can do with that kind of access, but that's just some of them. And then ownership-based attacks are distinct because these are attacks where the abuser is the person who owns the account, and that creates unique problems for the survivors. So this might be something like being the person who owns the phone contract that their phone is on, or having been the person who set up their device or account. and then using that access to shut off their air conditioning in the summer or shut off their internet access. They can also be the person who set up someone's accounts for social benefits, such as Medicare or housing applications, and then use that to lock the survivor out of accessing those benefits that they needed. So exposure of private information, I think the number one thing that comes to mind with that is non-consensual intimate images. This is also known as revenge porn or sexploitation. So this is sharing intimate images. This can be both things that are overtly sexual in nature, but it can also be context dependent. So if someone, for example, practices veiling for their religion, to share photos of someone who is unveiled can both incite harassment from their own community or social ostracization. So this is really something that's a very broad term, which is why we use this phrase of intimate images instead of anything that's more overtly related to sexualizing someone. Other examples of exposing private information are coerced spending, like sharing, doxing someone basically and sending their credit card information out to people that shouldn't have that information, or identity theft, or otherwise just using blackmail and extortion based on the private information that you have. So that could also be outing someone who's part of the LGBTQ+ community. Harassment, again, like we saw in the example, like spoofing phone calls, sending mass emails, posting someone's information on public websites that people harass them. We have had clients do this from like sharing someone's private information in prison, and having the people who are in the prison harass the survivor. And then finally, the last category that I kind of added to talk about was technology-assisted monitoring. And I don't yet have a great term for this, but it's something that's come up a lot more, which is abusers installing AV devices that they own in public spaces, or like to capture the survivor's entrance to their building, to their driveway, or by adding a personal tracker such as a tile or an AirTag to cars, pets, children. It's also IoT is not really captured by any of the other categories. And IoT is something where even in the same home, if someone has like a smart bulb that automatically turns on when someone is in a certain area of the home and the abuser is the one who owns that, then they can use that to kind of monitor where the survivor or victim is within their own space. So that's kind of like this high level view of all of the different ways that we have seen technology being used to harm survivors of intimate partner violence. But I just wanted to note that in practice, this taxonomy, it's useful for that categorization, but abusers can use multiple avenues of attacks to achieve the same results, right? So it's not like they just pick one way of doing this and then stick to that. So for example, to find a victim's location, which is one of the biggest concerns that we see, you can use an app like Find My Phone and add yourself to that, and through that account compromise, get their location. Or you can get proximal information from logging into their calendar or their emails, where they would email people about where they'll be. It can be through ownership-based attacks, like having access, being the owner of a phone plan can give you a lot of information about where a cell phone is and what it's doing. And you can also use, for example, personal trackers. So you can use a combination of these methods to get varying levels of detail about someone's location. And I also just wanted to touch on spyware, because I think this is something that comes up a lot. CETA originally actually began as a spyware field study. They were just trying to, I joke sometimes that they were just trying to conduct this field study on, you know, how often is spyware actually being used in practice? And then they accidentally started an essential service, which was CETA. Ironically, spyware is not something that we see that often at CETA. This could just be an artifact of the fact that we are seeing clients who have been referred to us through the mayor's office, family justice centers, and so that they tend to have already been separated from the abuser if they were in a romantic or domestic relationship. And so again, this might be a limitation of our referrals, but we find that dual use apps are more common. And what I mean by a dual use app is that that's an app that has a legitimate purpose that the survivor might have installed themselves and wanted to use, like Find My Phone, but it's being repurposed by the abuser without the survivor's consent or knowledge to gather information about them or otherwise harm them. And as just a more general point from that, tech abuse here is usually not technically sophisticated. We are not often seeing people whose phones have been rooted. We are not seeing like SIM cloning. We're not seeing Pegasus downloaded on people's phones, although people are often concerned about those things when they hear them. It's usually just these very kind of pedestrian ways that people are using to harm people, but sometimes with a devastating effect. So I also wanted to briefly talk about how we respond to technology abuse. So I think one question that might come up is like, how is this any different from like the Genius Bar, or is, you know, some kind of customer support who responds to this? Like, why do we need a clinic that's specifically talking about tech abuse with tech experts? And it's that our intervention protocols need to be sensitive to the context that the survivors and clients that we see are in, right? So for one thing, if we are dealing with account compromise, one of the first steps that we would want to take is to identify who has access to the account before we do anything else, right? So we don't just want to jump in and change a password or say get a new phone. You first want to see who has access to that phone or to that account and document it in case the survivor wants to use that as evidence in an order of protection later. Then we also just want to take stock of like, what is visible to the abuser? What is visible to the person that you're concerned about? Because there's a big possibility of abuse escalation, and we actually have seen this quite often, where if someone had access to someone's iCloud or someone's Gmail, and then we take away that access, the abuser can escalate their abuse. So they might show up at the victim's house, or they might start calling them or start calling their family members, or it might actually lead to an instance of physical violence. So we need to notify the survivor, like, hey, the person who you are concerned about might be able to see that you are taking some actions to take back control of your technology. And do you have a plan to be safe? Like, do you have a safety plan with your social worker or with your caseworker that can help make sure that you aren't coming into further harm? I think another thing that's important is to be aware of like this kind of cascade or like kind of this waterfall effect, where a user might be logged into a recovery account or have two-factor authentication set up on the account, but not necessarily be logged in. So we want to be able to trace the way that all of these accounts are interlocking with each other and what information they're giving to each other before we start taking any actions or start suggesting any actions, actually. Because the second part of this is that we want to have a trauma-informed perspective, that these are people who have had a lot of agency taken away from them, and we're trying to empower them, right? Like, we're trying to educate them about what is going on with their technology, what steps that they can take, and letting them choose how they want to respond to any signs of abuse or compromise that they see. And sometimes they might choose a response that doesn't make sense to us or that we don't think is the best option, but we want to respect that and make them feel comfortable doing what they feel is right for their situation. And we also don't want to just say like, well, just don't use technology, because it's such a critical part of our everyday life that we want them to feel empowered to use that normally the way that other people do, to the best of their ability while still remaining safe. So that's kind of an overview of just how, what we do in practice, what kinds of technology abuse we see, and how we respond to it. Based off of what the clients that we've seen in my time in actually responding to these issues, I've run into some open issues where we see these problems repeatedly, but we don't have a solution for them. So it's a lot of times where we're just kind of, you know, saying, there's nothing that we can do, I'm sorry. And so I wanted to share what those issues were, because I think that that's something that might be most interesting for this group. So I would say that the first issue is, what would an IPv-aware protocol look like for devices that collect and transmit sensitive or personal data? And how do we have a design process that includes marginalized and vulnerable populations from the start? And to kind of make this a little bit more concrete, I think a good case study here is AirTags. So AirTags were released, and these are some example headlines of how they were almost immediately used for stalking and for criminal usage. A woman who found that an AirTag had been attached to the underside of her wheel well at a bar from someone that she didn't know. Two people from the TV show The Bachelor, who were one of them ended up attaching an AirTag to one of the contestants' cars after the show ended. And just pointing out that there have been like at least 50 cases that we know of in 8 months in this short period that was reported to the news of non-consensual tracking. And personal trackers were originally designed with the only threat models being, I'm the person who owns this item and I've lost it. Like the threat model is me losing it. The other threat model was like the stranger stole something from me and I need to know where it is. So it was never really looking at it from this perspective of how they could be abused or how they could be used to target, the vulnerable. And this hadn't really been as huge of an issue until Apple released their AirTag, because suddenly the network for personal trackers just became huge because of the way that they work. Their ability to pair with any Apple device just made it so that you could attach this AirTag and track anyone almost anywhere in the United States pretty easily. And that had immediate consequences for vulnerable populations. So I guess the question here is like, how do we balance this original purpose of not losing items and theft protection with IPV and stalking threats, right? So one example is having cross-platform detection. Right now, AirTags will alert any Apple user that they are being followed by an AirTag. You will not get that alert if you have an Android or if you have like a non-iOS device. So can we develop a standard where whenever you have these kinds of trackers that are being released, that across all platforms and across all electronic devices, that you would receive that type of notification? And what would that look like? And what would we need to have that? I think another thing to think about is, can there be like a neutral third party who holds suspicious tracker data? So if an AirTag is moving with someone without their consent, that would trigger a notification. Instead of sending that directly back to the person who set up the AirTag, can we hold that information so that if it's needed to track down something that has been stolen or lost, it can be accessed, but it's not necessarily immediately sending real-time information about where that is, right? So these are just some possibilities. And I think it's a good example of like when we release new technology that is building a new network, how do we take into account these processes? How do we design them with a process that centers the vulnerable and marginalized populations from the start instead of finding it out after the fact? A second question that I've touched on a little bit is how do we approach ID verification in an IPV context, and specifically where IPV survivors may never have had control of their own devices or may have lost control of their devices and not been able to recover their accounts. So the way identity verification works is it generally assumes that someone who would be trying to recover the account wouldn't have any personal information about the actual owner, and that's just not true in IPV. And we see this abused so often at CETA. So I think a big case study here is Android data recovery, and this is one of the hardest things for us to see, and one of the hardest situations that, like, emotionally, I think that I have seen when I've worked with clients. So 3 times in the past month alone have we had clients present with the same scenario where they owned an Android phone and the phone plan was owned by the abuser, so they don't have access to the call logs or the text message history. Their data was backed up to a Google Drive because it was an Android phone, and the abuser just locked them out of the Google account, deleted all of the evidence, and then factory reset the phone remotely. So all of a sudden, the clients just had zero access to any of the information that had ever been used on that phone, right? And so, we're seeing clients who have been in a relationship with someone for 10 years, for 35 years, and they don't have a single trace of digital evidence that they ever contacted or had any relationship with the person who was abusing them. And because they don't have that information, they don't have any evidence that can get them an order of protection saying, do not contact me through electronic means, which is just absolutely wild. So, how do we do identity verification and account recovery? And do we, is it ethical in some ways for data to be backed up to a Google Drive if there is no account recovery process for Google Drive accounts, which is currently the situation? And then finally, this is the last one, which is how do applications communicate across varying levels of technology and data literacy? So a lot of our clients are not really good with technology, is how they'll describe themselves. But what features can we build into applications? And this is more of an application level problem that allows users to have ownership over their own data, especially when it's needed for evidentiary or safety purposes. So some case studies here, there's like the safety checks that was just released by Apple in their most recent announcement about updates to iOS, where Google also has the notifications like you should turn on 2-factor authentication And Facebook has some safety check features as well. And what they do is they walk users through their delicate privacy settings in this really user-friendly manner. And that's been really helpful for clients to be able to take control of their own data and be aware of what's being shared, right? Like to have some kind of dashboard of how their data is actively being shared on that platform. They could be better by providing abuse escalation warnings, like I mentioned, or resources to local IPv agencies. But right now, I think that they're a really good step in the right direction. A kind of bad example of data requests here are that a lot of applications will dump critical user data or time data and share it in this really unfriendly way in like this JSON file dump. So Google will keep a 28-day history of logins. Apple will not keep any history of logins to an iCloud. So once someone has been booted off an account, you can't ever prove that they used to have access. And both Facebook, Instagram, and Tinder all have these like JSON file dumps where you request your own data. And then we have to kind of process that data for our clients because they're trying to find out like what date someone followed them on Instagram to prove that someone violated an order of protection. So ways that that data can be released and something that's like more friendly to those with less technical literacy. So I'll leave that with those three questions because I'm not sure how much time is left and I wanted to leave some time for questions. We do have other efforts at CETA that I didn't talk about so far, which includes like some laws that we've advocated for that protect survivors at the state and federal level. We do advocate for funding and guidance for other tech clinics. And we do have, obviously, research that we publish. So there is like a whole corpus of research that's publicly available. And feel free to ask me about any of those if you're curious. And I'll leave these contacts and resources up while people are asking anything that they have. This is my email if you have like other questions about like volunteering with us, or if you wanted to share our volunteer applications with any groups that you know of that would be interested, and our website and Twitter account.
Alana, thanks so much. This has been really, really interesting, as I knew it would be. We've already got a queue started, but a reminder to folks in the room, join the queue from your phone. Go ahead, Tom.
Hi, Lana. That was really, really wonderful. Thank you very much. I had a personal experience of something very similar along these lines actually in the past, and it was related to an iCloud account, and it wasn't abuse against myself per se, but I was a sort of a third party in this situation, and it was quite frustrating to find that there wasn't. I don't think we have an open equivalent like this in the United Kingdom. I think that there is an equivalent, certainly with the police forces, but it isn't very visible, if that makes sense. So there doesn't appear to be a similar thing. Similarly, as well, at my employer, BT, we're currently having an interesting conversation at the moment around the rights of minors, those under 18 children. And I think this is something I'm going to want to share with them because I think it's very, very important and relevant. Question-wise, I was hoping, I don't know, I think I know the answer to this, but have you been able to have any engagement with some of the large device manufacturers and service manufacturers, people like the Facebooks, the Apples, the Googles? Have you been able to have any engagement with them for the purpose of helping inform the design of their products in the future? Is there a way in which you can, maybe they won't listen, maybe they won't ask, but is there a way that you can get in touch with them, offer some help in terms of research that you've conducted and cases that you've worked on? It feels like it's the sort of thing where seatbelts were designed with men in mind, and so seatbelts cause more complications with women in accidents. If we are in that situation where they could benefit from the information that you've, and perhaps anonymous information from the cases that you've worked on, it may help actually inform some of the designs that they make. But they should be reaching out to folks like you, I think. But have you had any of that at all, or is it something that we can help with?
Yeah, I think so. We have had some of those interactions, I'm happy to say, and we do really try to, not view them as adversaries or antagonists, but try and view them as like community stakeholders and partners in this. So I did recently speak, Meta does a good job of like soliciting input from both CETA, also the National Network to End Domestic Violence. In the UK, there's Refuge, which offers a lot of support in this area, and they do have a technology safety team, although it's quite small. I think it's like 3 people, and I know them all. And so they do solicit feedback about this, and there have been I'm not sure what the disclosure agreements for some of them are, so I won't list other ones, but there have been other companies that have solicited input from us when designing new features, particularly around language and around the kind of, again, that protocol of documenting evidence first, and then, a warning of escalation kind of thing. So yeah, I think there's some positive news there. I think the downside is that there are some times where we have just pointed out these things over and over again. Like, we have pointed out many times that Android data recovery is devastating to people. Like, to think about the fact that, like, you can be in a relationship with someone for 35 years and they can erase every single trace of digital evidence that you were ever together. Emotionally, it's really hard, but then legally, it creates a lot of complications as well. And it's something where, we may not, like, sometimes it kind of seems like people are aware, or like that some people at those places are aware, but they just are kind of choosing to, maybe there's not as much pressure around doing it the same way that pressure was created around air tags, right? So I think that that's part of that thing of trying to design these processes that, include stakeholders from various communities from the start, right? But yeah, I think it's a really great point. And I'm sorry to hear about your experience. I know, like, even as being a third party to something, it's a really hard thing to witness. It can be like, a very emotionally difficult.
I think it's, as you point out, I think it's actually scarily common. And so
Yeah.
I look forward to it not being.
Mhm.
Thank you for all of your work in this. And I like the suggestion that you had on the protocol for AirTags to be sharing that information with other phones. I think that was actually extremely valid. And I hope someone is able to work on it. I wish I were. Thank you for your help.
Thank you.
Yeah, I put myself in the queue to, again, thank you for a great talk. I was really looking forward to this conversation and entering the group, because for a long time, Sophia and I have been planning to write some of this down, because it is mostly centered on what many have already raised, which is the threat model is incomplete. And it isn't, I mean, yes, I think this is the very strongest use case. It's maybe the simplest, most straightforward expression of it, but it also happens kind of as a local, the local threat can be others. It could be also your boss, potentially, if it's really like, does somebody have access to your device? Does somebody have access to your Wi-Fi network? Does somebody have a social relationship to you? All those things you very clearly laid out in the beginning is what comprises that threat model. It can also be parents and children, right? There's
Yes.
some, view that teenagers should, be protected in that way from things like that. So that's really great. And having, I think the things that you've written, I'm sure, in terms of your guidance that you have produced as your clinic could be a really useful starting point for us to also unpack. It's really interesting that you mentioned you started out to study spyware, because that's also where I think Sophia and I started when we were thinking about this. Like, what if we looked at the spyware and tried to figure out how it works, and then wrote that down? And then you noted, like, actually, that's not even the biggest part of the problem. So that's really useful that I didn't realize. And another one that I wanted to highlight that I think also is incomplete, or we don't hear about enough, is data loss as an attack. So deleting things. I mean, we know like ransomware and things like that is an attack, but I think we don't often have the right sort of imagination around how that can happen quite more often than we document or think about. And then I think another thing that really liked in terms of solution space that you mentioned was around, maybe because this is an effort in empowering users more, is how we can think about more mechanisms of presenting data to everyone, all users, that can help, like, in an innocuous way, so everybody gets this sort of data presentation, to empower people to know more about what's going on. So one really easy example that is now very pervasive is, like, tells you the last time anyone logged into your account and from what device. Like, that didn't always used to be so ubiquitous, but it is now. I think a lot more of those kinds of things where you can look from your device or from your account to see certain kinds of activity that would be enabled for every kind of account, those are like examples of like proactive, measures that could really help. So thanks so much for your work on this, Alana. I wonder if you, I don't know if you were here earlier for some of the discussion we had around what HRPC does, but if at all you had feedback on whether or not you think some of this, like that you see the technical community that we have here in useful in furthering your work. I wonder if you have thoughts on that.
Thank you, Mallory. Yeah, and I just wanted to kind of like just a little bit of responding to some of the things that you mentioned. One of them about spyware showing up. I do want to repeat again, we have research talking about like forums of abusers and how they go and seek out spyware and how they like kind of use them. So those things are being used. I will say that like it's probably more common if our clients were predominantly in shelters, which they're not. They usually have already separated. So there's a higher spyware risk when someone has physical access to your device, because typically they do need that access in order to install the spyware. And so for a lot of our clients, that's not necessarily, they might have changed out their device or something, but they are still logged into the same account. So I don't necessarily want to downplay it in that way, but just say like it's not something that we see because of this group here. But yeah, I think those login messages are really, really useful. And I think just generally letting people know, like for any data that is sensitive that's being transmitted over the internet, to let people know like information about who has logged into it, who has seen it, and who has had access to it is a transparency that we should just kind of set as a standard on the internet. I unfortunately was not here for the earlier part about what HRPC does because I had a meeting that I couldn't get out of, but I would love to hear other people's suggestions based on like what I've said and what you know that that you all do that you think would be relevant.
And I see Sophia joined the queue, so maybe she'll have thoughts on that too. But yeah, go ahead, Adrian.
Great presentation, Lana. I also am involved in advocacy, particularly with respect to digital identity as a dual-use technology. And my question to you is specific to how do you see the role of biometrics in the digital identity protocols and related protocols related to digital identity? Because is it an opportunity to improve to shift the balance of the dual-use technologies in favor of the good, or is it a risk, in your opinion, based on your experience? Thank you.
Yeah, that is a great question. I was wondering if someone would ask about biometrics, and I'm glad that you did. So it is something that we have seen biometrics being abused in the clinic. And I think the really important thing with biometrics and with any other tool that's being used for identity verification is to think about it from this model of like what happens in situations that are not just that distant attacker, right? Because I think the danger of biometrics, like the positive thing about biometrics is that if that person doesn't have access to your physical devices, then, it's a really like solid security mechanism. But if they do still have access to it, right? And what happens is that they can very easily be abused if we see them as the end-all be-all identity verification. Like if we say, well, your thumbprint was used for this, so you must have authorized this, when it is very possible that someone who is being coerced or is in an abusive relationship could be threatened into using their own biometrics to verify something, right? So I think that we want to still see those limitations of it before viewing it as like an end all be all. Like if you had done this, then this must have been like proof that you consented to this. And to be able to have a little bit of flexibility in understanding how coercion can play a role in being in basically forcing people to use their biometrics to verify things that they didn't want to. So again, I think it's one of those neutral tools where we just need to think about it from these multiple different perspectives of different threat models and how they could be abused and how they could be used for security as well, right? Because we see this a lot with like even two-factor authentication, where when you're trying to recover account, people will say, well, like your two-factor authentication is set to this phone, so you don't have access to this phone, so it must not be you, right? Like that is as good as it gets. So, and then in reality, it was like the phone number is attached to a contract that was owned by the abuser, and you can't remove that phone from the contract because of the way that the laws work. So does that kind of answer, does that make sense?
Yes. Yes, thank you.
Hello, I'm Shivan. I work with Sophia at Brave browser. Thanks for your talk. I came in a little bit late. Apologies, it was a conflicting session, so maybe this was already covered. But I just wanted to say that typically in browsers and user agents, we don't consider the browser as like part of the, like if someone has access to your browser, then we think that, oh, it's game over. But it seems like there's a real, like, perspective that we're missing, where we could be doing stuff to make sure that so we don't just like keep this out of our threat model. So something that I guess Sophia and I were talking about was injecting random history over the last 2 hours, so that an attacker who has access to the machine doesn't see that someone went to a like a helpline website or something like that. So, and this this would not be too hard to come up with, like some fuzzing around this or some kind of protection. So I think if it'd be great if you can come give a talk at Brave Research, or if you have any suggestions around some technical measures that could be done, that would be helpful at the browser level to help protect victims. I think that would be really useful. Thanks.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much for your question and for bringing that up, because I think that there are definitely a couple things that browsers can do. One of them, like you said, I don't know if you had heard about this, but Google recently announced that they would no longer show in location history visits to abortion clinics due to the overturn of Roe v. Wade. And I think that there's a similar thing that can happen with browsers, to just like block out, like from your history, going to the websites that are like owned by nonprofits and agencies that are targeted towards IPV. So right now we tend to have these quick exit buttons, but to just not show it up in someone's browser history at all, I think is like a really important and helpful feature to build in. And then the other thing that comes to mind is the kind of built-in password management that comes with a lot of browsers, specifically with like wallets and financial accounts and passwords, where people don't tend to understand how those work or know how to limit it. And we've seen some really devastating effects of like financial abuse coming from people taking advantage of like the browser caching those passwords and credit card information, which is really useful. People love it and they want to use it. But like, I think to kind of just make sure that, that again, that intimate partner threat model is being considered for being able to take back control over those accounts. And feel free to reach out to me about the Brave part of it. I know that we have some great volunteers who have worked at Brave, so always happy to see that representation.
Okay, I'll just go. Yes, so thank you very much, Lana, for this. I was wanting to reiterate what Mallory was saying, that definitely we need then a draft to actually address this as a threat model that is very real, and maybe one of the most powerful attackers that the internet or networks can ever see is this kind of attacker. And unfortunately and sadly, it is not even considered most of the times when you're actually designing protocols or devices. And also want to reiterate that Shivan of the invitation, but we can follow that offline. But one of the things that I do have been thinking about, and maybe somehow we could share this visibility, is that recently there has been a lot of thoughts from different governments or law enforcement agencies to actually break end-to-end encryption systems because they lack data to properly protect. Sometimes they target children or also women. Well, what I know from my experience with also working with women's group in Latin America, law enforcement agencies has most of the time a lot of data already, and most of the times they don't believe any kind of survivor or ongoing abuse that is happening to them. So maybe they could share that visibility that indeed they have the data and sometimes they choose to ignore it, and that perhaps they just don't need more access to that data because the one that they have it, they're already ignoring. I don't know if that will be useful or some kind of visibility should be put there. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of clarify, you're talking about the idea that like law enforcement often already has this information and they're just ignoring it. Yeah, we see a lot of that invisibilization of technology as proof. And I think that it really depends on the area that you're in. But I think that one thing that we've thought about a lot is how we can serve as technical experts, as expert witnesses for people, to force them to take it seriously, so that there is somewhere that's speaking with authority. Because, you know, like was said in the last talk, people do listen to us more than they listen to like a lot of social workers or a lot of other agencies. To say, like, you know, based off of what we've seen, like, we can say with, you know, some authority, with the authority that we have, that this has happened, right? And to at least have that, like, a testimonial that is coming from our expert backgrounds, and sharing that and conferring that with survivors to help them gain some legitimacy. Although, again, like you said, like, it's only as powerful as people are willing to listen. But I think that there is something that we can do to use like our special vantage points as computer scientists and technologists to help maybe encourage people to listen. But definitely something that we've seen. And I think also educating law enforcement on this problem as well, the ones that are willing to help. I mean, we've seen the New York City Police Department have a DV task force that very accurately was telling our clients how to screen for AV devices that might have been left in their homes, and letting them know, like, any AV device is going to be transmitting things over the internet or through Bluetooth. So you want to check your Bluetooth and you want to change your internet and knock anything off of the internet that might have been transmitting data about you. So yeah, I definitely sympathize with that problem. And also, I just wanted to say thank you so much for inviting us to come speak, and always happy to talk about this with people of this background.
Fantastic. Thanks again. Really excellent work. We hope to see you and your colleagues back at some point. Be good to start some research and documentation with you. I think there's a lot of interest in this, updating threat models, taxonomy on threats, and that sort of thing. Would be really great to have you contribute. Thanks, Alana.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so I'm going to go back to my slides. Because now we're going to shift into talking about some of the group documents. I think first off, I don't know if we have anyone actually presenting on draft guidelines. That's not the slide. That's the slide.
As an author of draft guidelines, I'd be interested to hear from the IRTF chair where the review is on that, and where the progress is, what we can do, how we can help, and because I think it has been like this since last meeting.
Great. Hey, Colin.
Hi there. Yeah, I mean, I don't think this draft has changed significantly recently, so I mean, the issue, I think I've had sort of two sets of comments that I think I've raised in the past about this draft, and one is that it seems it talks about human rights based on the UN declaration, and doesn't seem to relate it concretely to how that's been reflected in particular sort of national guidance and so on. And as a result, it seemed to me when I was reading it to be very, the discussion was very abstract. And similarly, getting into the technical recommendations, the sort of quite abstract set of human rights it mentions then leads to some quite abstract discussion about technical recommendations, and that there doesn't seem to be a lot of nuance in those recommendations as a result. I mean, I think this is an issue I've raised a couple of times before. It seems like it would benefit from focusing the discussion a little more concretely on examples of how those rights are reflected in particular regions, and that would then let you give examples of concrete problems, which you could then concretely give examples of how, when discussing the particular technical issues, here is a specific example which that then applies to make it more concrete and more relatable to engineers. So I think that I'm not sure I explained that well, but that's sort of where I'm coming from with this.
Thanks so much, Colin. We've heard that from you in the last session, and we created a new version and a response to that since then.
The -13 version, I don't believe had any changes to address that. Did I miss a version?
That might, because I think we responded to this. So, and it has been since in your review.
I think there was, I mean, we discussed this at the last meeting, and I think that you suggested that you don't believe that's in scope. I'm not sure I agree.
Okay, then this is an excellent moment to discuss, because the examples have been extensively done in RFC 8280. And if we're going to discuss particular examples, which we've done in the example sections, but go there in different jurisdictions, then we get into the implementation area of human rights in local jurisdictions. And this is about the implementation of human rights, not about the implementation of local laws in local implementations, right?
I'm not quite sure I understand what you're getting at.
Oh, I was in the queue to explain a little bit further. So a lot of this discussion happened on the list. And I think the idea was actually that is really useful, that having something that maps onto local laws would be something that protocol developers strongly want. But unfortunately, that's a very different document and probably wouldn't be as useful as a sort of compendium of all of the countries that have laws that relate to this, but rather would be a document that explained maybe an approach to do so. So again, like taking a sort of higher level view that, yes, definitely checking with local laws and trying to square policy with, technical design, but also, technical policy, right? Like there would be guidance around what's the best practice to do that. And I think there's actually probably a fair amount of writing that exists on that already. Would be kind of, I think the task of this new document would be to, distill what that literature says and present it just in the case of, internet protocol design and deployment. But that work actually would be non-trivial and would probably lead to and best be described in a standalone document that's separate from the guidelines document around the International Human Rights Framework. And yes, as Neil noted in the chat, Sandra was interested in that work, but I think ultimately agreed like it shouldn't necessarily be in this document because it would kind of not well express that.
I mean, sure. I think that's not what I'm. If I'm understanding you right, that's not what I'm asking for. So perhaps I haven't explained what my concern is here. I think there's sort of two aspects to my concern about this draft. One is the sort of technical recommendations, and one is the positioning. And the technical recommendations are probably the easier one to address in that they seem in a lot of cases to lack nuance and lack depth. And I don't think there's so much anything wrong with them. It's just that they could often say more. And I think a lot of the reasons why it's hard to say more in the context of the document is that it doesn't really give specific examples of what is meant by the rights, and therefore it's hard to relate that to a specific example, which of what how that particular technical issue affects things. So it's difficult to make it concrete for an engineer in a way that an engineer writing a spec would go, oh yeah, I see how that's an issue, and I can then resolve it. And I think part of the reason for that, stepping back, is that it's trying to be expressed in this in what seems to me a quite abstract way without giving a concrete description of what you mean by those particular human rights. And clearly the authors are coming from a particular background of in a particular jurisdiction with a particular set of experience, and it's not to me clear how that necessarily relates to the broader experiences everyone is having. So I think documenting, you're making it a little more concrete might make it a bit more useful.
I have to say I'm slightly surprised by this because I thought we had responded and I thought it wasn't a guideline and we didn't receive a response. So it would be great to get this also in writing. I also want to know that the authors
I think this is the feedback I've
very...
given the last couple of meetings. So I'm surprised you say you haven't received a response.
No, but we've been working to address exactly that. And it's interesting to see that those changes are not recognized as a significant change in trying to get there. Also, the authors come from different expertises and different jurisdictions with a long-term experiences implementing human rights in different environments, and also doing human rights reviews of drafts and working with people who have doing human rights reviews on draft themselves here in the IETF. And every point that's brought up has a particular example with it. So that there are no examples, I find also a bit hard to understand. But I'm happy to have a look at the review and the comment.
I don't think I said there are no examples. I think I said the examples were vague. I think I said the technical points were vague and that specific examples would make some of them more concrete and easier to understand. And I believe I have given that feedback in writing several times, but I can find the email and resend it if you would find that helpful.
Okay, we seem to be in a versioning thing, whereas I think we have done the last revision and created a new version, whereas you think you might have given the last comments on the last version and the last responses. So let's work that out on a list.
Sure. I mean, if it's useful to have a call, then we can, if there's some high bandwidth interaction, then I'm happy to arrange that. But
yeah,
that would be excellent.
I would also want to join that call because, and sorry, I'm skipping the queue, Adrian, but I also am surprised, and I have been trying to follow as closely as I can. Also in the IRSG, where this document had been in your queue, Colin, to make sure that when it was in your queue and I was able to be available for questions and to follow the process. It seemed to me that it just hadn't been moving. But so it's on me also as chair for not realizing that there were pending changes. I thought actually that the suggestions had been pretty well addressed. So I'd love to take this offline with the two of you, or maybe we can also get Gershabad as the co-author, so that we're all on the same page about what actually has to happen with this draft, because I'm also with Niels. I had no idea that there were still
sure,
issues.
it seems we may have gotten crossed wires here, but yeah, I was expecting more updates, and it seems that you thought the updates had been done. So okay.
Yeah, definitely. That was also my impression. Yeah. So, okay. Well, I think there's not much else, but yeah, Adrian, you were in the queue. Please go ahead.
Yes, I think somewhat related to this point, though I apologize, I haven't seen these drafts. I am specifically interested in our group's how we approach delegation as a human right, because as I understand it, delegation is not the right to delegate, the right to choose your doctor or to choose your defense lawyer, or to be represented by an expert or a spouse, is not explicitly in the UN declaration, but then we have things like the freedom of association, which was mentioned explicitly in the beginning. And so in my work around protocols, both around GNAP and IETF and a bunch in other forums, I find that I need to have a more sophisticated understanding of privacy considerations from this point of view of delegation. And that's kind of both a comment and a question, if it's an appropriate one at this point. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrian, for those comments. I don't know if others want to respond. Okay. So I think we're off this now, Niels, but unless you want to just stay on camera, we can move to the next slides, which are all yours to pull up. You're on mute. Let's. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm also.
Sorry, could you share the slides?
Oh yeah, totally. Okay, let me know when you want to move them.
Yeah, here we go. Thanks so much for sharing the slides. Thanks all for the work. We're here to talk about draft association. Next slide, please. We've been working on this together with Stefan Couture, Gisela Perez de Acha, and Mallory. It is trying to deliver on one expected part of the objective of the research group, which is establish the relationship between particular human rights, particular freedom of expression, and the right to association to internet protocols. Gisela and I were the original editors. Stefan has taken up an editorial role and worked on an excellent literature review. Then we've been working on a way forward to define a particular structure. Then Stefan reconducted the literature review and identified their sub-questions that we then subsequently sought to answer through empirical examples that we did by adding case studies. I did that with Mallory to answer those sub-questions. And IETF113, Nick Doty became the dog shepherd and conducted a review. Next slide, please. That review done by Nick was super thorough and resulted in several pull requests and an email to the list. And what the draft is now looking at is what are the considerations of the right to freedom of assembly and the right to freedom of association for protocol development. It contains a literature review that results in 7 research sub-questions, and the sub-questions are answered with examples or cases of IETF protocols. And in a restructure where we have still something to discuss, whether to structure the examples from issue-centric to protocol-centric. And right now they're issue-centric because the sub-questions are as well. And then to the conclusions. Next slide, please. So since 2009, there have been NITs, there's been lots of copy editing going on, and a lot of deepening, adding references, and then what we're still now looking at is this restructuring. Should spam and mailing list be shown as cases to answer particular sub-questions, or should they be mentioned once? But if we do that, then we might need to restructure the whole thing, and it's not be consistent through the whole document. So that's a bit of a can of worms that I do not necessarily know how to solve. And Nick opened some good questions needing citations and proposed text on the HRPC mailing list, but I have sought to address them all in the latest version. So I'm also curious to hear what you'll think about that. Next slide, please. And this is the structure way it is now. So there are the different sub-questions. So one is about got no peace, about assembling freely and addressing others and the right to demonstration, holistic agency, it's mentioning mailing list and spam again as example, and in the civics and cyberspace, it's also showing mailing lists again. So right now we're answering based on issues, and these technologies are used in different ways for different examples. They could also be put together, but then would then problematize the way that we've structured the answers now. So it's a bit either or, and it's hard to do this, to do both at the same time, because that would then lead to like a demolishing of the structure we've been working long and hard at. Next slide, please. So the proposed actions is establish agreement on the way forward for the examples, so they're keeping the structure or changing it. I propose a title change because freedom of association on the internet was not very clear that it's actually about protocols. So I workshop the title a bit to make it very clear. So the proposal for the title change is the human rights to freedom of association and assembly and internet protocols. We call for volunteers to review and revise, even though we've largely done a lot of work, but other people are always welcome to review and make suggestions. And looking to hear from Nick what he thinks about what we did with the document and whether it fixed the issues we had. Next slide, please. I think that was it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because this is a working group document, we felt like there were some things we wanted to bring to you all to get your feedback on. And yeah, would love for folks to jump in the queue. Nick, if you had feedback now, if you've had a chance to look at the new version. I think it just went up this week, so apologize for not getting that in sooner. Well, it did get in before the doc freeze, but then Niels was so industrious as always and couldn't help to make the rest of the changes.
Yes, thank you. I'll be very brief. I had that question about structure because I thought it was confusing to me as a reader about coming back to those topics. But I do think the issue, I think I understand better now. Oh, we have to do it issue by issue, and some of the same protocols and protections are going to come up in those different issues. So I think that makes sense. I think it's asking for me to do a re-review. I think that's reasonable, and I might suggest wording changes with them just to help people like me who were confused. But I don't think we need. I think the argument for having the structure issue by issue that makes sense to me. So that would be my initial reaction. If other people have a different proposal, happy to hear it.
Yeah, if we sort of go back to, just so everybody can see on this structure question, let me go back to where we've got, sorry, the current structure. So the point being that, like, yeah, on a couple of these different things, we talk about the same thing or the same phenomenon from a tool perspective, from a protocol perspective. But it's because we're trying to answer, remember these cases and examples are trying to answer the previous section that begs more areas of research from the literature review. So we're trying to pull those out more. I think your comment, another structural comment you had, Nick, was just about expanding them. So these cases and examples aren't very robust. They don't say very much. They're short. So one thing we could do is, actually just try to say more, which I think is a fair point.
Yeah, I fully agree with Nick's point. And in the new version, I sought to expand them already and embed them deeper in, connect them closer to the question and make the answer super precise after the end of every paragraph that ends a section.
Awesome. Are there any thoughts on the title change? To me, it just makes it clear. It's longer, but that's fine. Okay, I'm hearing that's not controversial. Good. So I think in that case, we would really just ask, I think we're over time, but yeah, we would just ask that for folks interested, we can post this to the list. Obviously, we'll post the notes. Yeah, we'll get a new version out soon. And then, yeah, if Nick, you wanted to do a re-review, maybe before the next version's out, if we could go back and either accept your PRs or do other things. Cool. Great. I think that is the end, but we did have AOB, I believe. There may be folks I know have approached me and asked if there would be time to consider new areas of work, which is something we always want to do. So while we're a bit over time, we are over time, is it not? Then yeah, let's go ahead and just pause though for a second before we close out. Are there anybody want to propose new work or had other business related to the working group they wanted to bring up before we close? Okay. I'm not seeing anybody in the room. I'm not seeing anybody online. So with that, really appreciate you all for coming. Thanks again for a lovely session. A special thanks to our speakers, Bharath and Alana, for coming along and inspiring us to do new and interesting and very, very important areas of work in the IRTF. Yeah, thanks very much to Colin, to Nick, to folks who really had to come off mic or come on mic and on short notice. Okay, bye everybody. Take care.
Thank you so much, Mallory. Next time I'll be there.
Yay. Thanks so much for the notes as well. They're excellent notes. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, Nick also took a really nice work on that.
Okay, bye everybody.
Okay, bye.
All you